So welcome to Now Everything Changes with David Jones, Steve Monks and myself, David Shepherd. And today we are going to be very original and different because we're going to be looking at creativity and all that means. What is creativity? How do you become a creative? How can you improve your creativity? Hopefully, all of those questions are going to be looked at today. So without any delay, I'm going to pass over to Mr. Jones, David Jones, and ask him a little bit about creativity because he's an author. I'm wondering what sparks your creativity, David?
I've just got back from a long walk with my brother. We're in the Lake District this week. So we're on the southern fringes of the national park. We went for a walk of about 5.5 miles in beautiful sunshine, -3 temperatures, sheep freezing themselves in the field, but looking slightly warmer than we did. So for me, one of the best ways to get the creative juices flowing is by going for a walk. And that even on the walk today, there was all kinds of creative writing ideas flowing through my head. So that's probably the main way for me. It's a walk, or it can equally be a piece of music, a single line in a movie or a TV show, or an overheard conversation. For my birthday in 2023, my wife, Jo, bought me a mug which said, "I'm a writer. Anything you say may be heard and used against you."
Oh, gosh. So when you say all of those things can spark your creativity, has that always been the case? Or is it something that you've learned?
No, I'm of the view that if you've got, I guess, a spark of creativity, which I think would apply to the overwhelming majority of the population, then it's something that needs to be worked on like exercise. You're not exercising maybe your physical body, but you are exercising your mind. I would like to think that writing in particular is a craft. I think it's something that can be learned, but I also think it gets better the more you do.
Lovely. Steve, fact, that ties in with what you've been looking at recently, doesn't it? I'd like to go back later to define creativity, but you've been looking at how different parts of the brain seem to handle creative aspects.
Well, you put me on the spot because it is a work in progress. And if you talk to a writer about what they're writing, it's better when you talk to them when they've finished writing.
Well, we don't want to know anything about it then.
No, but for the best of my current ability, the book that I'm writing or the research I'm doing is on the brain, the left side and the right side, and how they interact, and which part does what, which is a developing science, but it does seem to be accepted now that it's the right side of the brain that's associated predominantly with creativity, though it doesn't mean that the left side isn't creative. There are elements in both sides. It is a very dynamic sort of interaction between the two. I think it's probably best for me not to carry on too much on that, because I think that will be a program in itself once I've figured it out myself. And I don't want to be just babbling a load of old nonsense at the moment, which...
I was going to say, why change the habit of a lifetime? But perhaps that's a bit unfair, isn't it? No, well, let's ask this then, Steve. If creativity is something that we can work on, what are some of the ways that we can do that?
The problem is that the way I'm built is something that only I can sort of talk about, and find it hard to explain the creativity that I work with, because in my case, it's very much an inherited thing. My mother was very creative. She's gone now, but as an artist, as a dressmaker, and as a writer as well. And there's a whole long line before her of creative people, and I'm sort of part of that line. And my 3 boys were extremely creative, so I was actually born that way. So I'm not the sort of person that can theorize about it, because it's just I am. I am a creative, and I probably could never teach the subject because I don't know how anyone else ticks. I presume that we are all capable of being creative. I'm sure we all have a spark in us, but I suppose it's all a matter of degree. So in terms of, what was the question?
Are there things that we can do to actually improve our creativity?
Right. Well, when I finish the book, I'll be able to say that, because there is a connection between, going back to the brain thing, the right brain and creativity. And there are ways that you can exercise the right side of your brain, which in theory would then increase your creativity. And there is someone who we are going to invite on a future podcast, Rosie Smith, who is creative in a very different way to me. I'm creative in terms of words and ideas. She's creative mainly in terms of art and crafts and design. And she teaches people to unlock their creativity. So I think that is something that hopefully, we can ask her about when we finally get her on board. But for me, it's just, I just, it's hard to get someone to describe how they are when they don't have any other frame of reference other than themselves.
Yeah.
Because when I was growing up, I thought everyone was like me. I thought everyone could sort of drift into a second world, which I did quite often, and have there's a whole fantasy world at my disposal, and writing stuff and all sorts of. I thought everyone did it until I realised that they didn't.
I did have some more questions, because I class myself as not a particularly creative person, but I think the paradigm is that we think of creativity in terms of art, music, drama, writing, crafts, and things like that. But I'm wondering if there's a sort of wider definition of what creativity is.
I thought I would actually challenge that, because one thing that really peeves me is when, certainly in the business world and the media world, a creative is always seen as someone who can draw, someone who's visual. It's very rare that you hear of sort of writers so much, or dramatists, or people with ideas, are called creatives. So when people talk about creatives, they tend to think, oh, well, that person can do something visually. And that really narrows the perception of what creativity is. And you're right, David, creativity can come in so many different ways. It's far broader than people realize. And we have people in our little group who consider themselves not creative at all. We had a creativity conference that David Jones went to a couple of years ago, part of our foundations thing. And there's 2 or 3 people who are part of our team who are very reluctant to be there, because they said there's no creativity in them at all. And yet you look at them, they're creative in ways that they don't realize that they're creative. They're not creative in that they can draw or dance or write particularly well. But creativity surely is just exercising a gift that you have to bring something into the world that wasn't there before. And it can take many forms. So everyone probably has it. I'm not a person to ask about it, but I do believe, I think in deep down, that everyone is capable, except for my father and my dad. I sort of find I was just thinking, my mum always, her complaint, he hasn't got a creative cell in his body.
Oh dear.
And that's because she was ultra creative and he was probably just a normal person.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't remember anything that he did that was original. So I suppose there are some people that maybe don't function to the degree that others do, but then it's all a matter of degree anyway.
Well, if it is innate, why is it important that somebody would learn to be creative or develop creativity? If that's the way we are, and that's the way nature has made us, God has made us, is there any point in trying to be something that you're not?
Well, I think it's immensely satisfying to have creative gifts. For me personally, when I was talking to Monica, my wife, and I gain more from writing about something than reading about it, and which is a bit weird, because I've recently written a series of devotionals for this magazine, and Monica says, why are you writing these things? You don't even read them. You never read devotionals. You're not the sort of person. And I said, it's true, but by writing them, it's actually taught me more than actually reading someone else's writings. And I'm not saying that is normal, but there is, for me, there's great satisfaction in not just creating something, but doing something that other people appreciate as well. Us creatives do require feedback, Doesn't always happen. And I'm sure David Jones has got plenty of stories about such things. So have you got any particular gripes of the things that you've created, David, that where no one's responded at all? Because I can give you loads of stories.
I think for me, feedback is essential as a writer. You want to know you are along the right lines, I guess, particularly if you're writing for, which I tend to more often than not, if you're writing for what we would call a secular audience, you need feedback. So having sent manuscripts off to publishers and agents, you are looking for some positive feedback, hopefully, that can help you develop more as a writer. I think when somebody is overly critical in response to something you've done, I don't find that particularly helpful. I know for me as an educator that I was always trying to encourage students. So even where maybe they did something that wasn't quite what I was looking for or what the exam board required, I would always try to encourage, because I think we all work better when we have this circle of encouragement around us. So for me, I sent a manuscript off last year, around about April, to about a dozen different agents. It was the first, probably the first adult novel I'd ever written. And from some of the agents, I got no response at all. From a few, I got thank you for submitting, for thinking of us. And then from about 3 or 4, I got some really good positive feedback. And that level of encouragement, particularly because it came, I think I previously mentioned on other podcasts, particularly because it came from really high-end agencies in the UK market, that really has given me the impetus that I require to keep going.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because there's stories of people who've been rejected and ultimately have gone on to be very successful. From the Beatles, who I think were originally rejected by Decca, to J.K. Rowling, who struggled for ages to get a manuscript published.
Yeah, it's funny because I had a similar experience, but not so positive as David, because all those TV screenplays I wrote this year, I sent them all off to agents and production companies, and I never got a single reply, apart from an acknowledgement that you've sent us something, but we have a long list, etc., etc. So well done you, David, getting some response. But the thing is, not getting a response from that channel hasn't bothered me, because, as you know, I found other ways of actually getting a response from people actually using them and dramatizing them and actually seeing the end product, which, by the way, you can see on our podcast, our other podcast, which are called All About the Story. Just a little, is it okay advertising our other podcast?
Yeah, you can say what you like, Steve, but you can't see it, you can hear it.
You can hear it. Oh, you can't see us here, thank goodness. but so yeah, sometimes you don't need, let's say, peer review from those outside your fold. It's just enough to get friends and family to respond, people who you want to get good feedback from them, because you've got a relationship with them, and that's fine by me. I've been writing for years and getting very little feedback, and that doesn't bother me as much as it did. Just follow the urge and just create. Just don't allow lack of feedback to quash your creativity. It's something that I've learned, that I get knocked over and I keep bouncing back. That's what you got to keep doing. It's not necessarily about feedback, but it'd be good to have more feedback. But it's not a perfect world, is it?
But it seems to me that you have to be a bit of a masochist, or somebody who has a high degree of perseverance and persistence to keep on going when actually the feedback is very limited.
Yeah, it's something you acquire. But I've got a separate question to ask actually David Jones, because it is quite relevant, which is connected to the subject. Do you remember? Maybe not. I think David Shepherd might remember this, as when we were preparing for our conference 2 years ago, a lot of us read a book by this educator called Ken Robinson, who was fantastic. We watched his podcasts, we watched his YouTubes, and he is an educator. I think I can't remember what country he was from. I think it's from New Zealand, actually. And he was a very, very articulate teacher. and he's done TED Talks and such things. And his big thing is in education. The educational system in the Western world quashes any creativity. It's all about academic achievement. It's all along the Greek model of the only thing that school should do is to discover intelligence and reasoning ability and all those very sort of Greek qualities. Whereas creativity was something, because it doesn't have a practical purpose in the real world, not as rated as highly, so not really taught. So I just wondered whether David Jones, being an educator and coming from that system, because you were talking about you had a choice between art and music, but it does tend to be those sort of subjects are sort of appended to the end. Maths is important, science is important. When it comes to the arty things, they're just, because they have no monetary value in the working world so much, perhaps it's just not part of the system. And he was very strong on this. So have you heard of him?
Only because you sent us the link, Steve.
Yeah.
And I would definitely concur with what you've just said. We've got this ludicrous education system where everybody is basically funneled down the same labyrinth of maths and science. And Prime Minister last year made a speech about trying to make sure that students right up to the age of 18 were going to have compulsory maths. I do find that absolutely ridiculous. If we go back to what David Shepherd said, he doesn't see himself necessarily as a creative, and yet he's using audio and editing things. And I was going to raise the fact that if you look at a TV program or a movie and you look at the end credits, the amount of creatives in there. So so you've got the actors, you've got the writers, you've got a director, you've got a producer. That's probably what most people would think of when you think of a successful TV or movie. But if you stayed to the end of the credits in a movie theatre, you'd be there for a full 10 minutes. Because look at all the other things that are there. So you've got people who do the sound. You've got people who are location scouts trying to find the best locations. Interesting that we referred last week on our television podcast. We mentioned about Fool Me Once, this new Netflix drama. And one of the locations for that was actually the school where my two children currently attend. We were able to recognize the school. So you have a location scout, a location manager, you have a runner. You have this whole plethora of people who are creatives, and no TV show and no movie could function without all of these creatives. It's really important that people understand that. You may not be able to write, you may not be able to act, you may not be able to produce or direct, but you could be a fabulous editor. You could be phenomenal at finding the best locations. So I think we can limit ourselves in terms of our creative energies and our creative juices and think, well, I haven't got anything to offer. And I've got to say, I think that's a nonsense.
Well, I think that's the paradigm that we've got to think about trying to change, so that people don't see themselves as I'm not creative. But actually, there are things that I can do that contribute to creative activities.
That's right, David. And if I think about writing, if I ever, and hopefully that this will happen, but I should just say, I'm sure Steve would agree with this, I write for myself primarily.
Yeah.
So if anybody else likes it, that's wonderful. And if anybody decides to publish it, well, that's clearly the icing on the cake. And I'm doing it because I enjoy the whole creative process around writing. But of course, I want to be successful. I want somebody to pick up and say, you know what, David, we want to be your agent. We want to represent you. So I hope that happens. I will carry on writing regardless anyway. However, if I did get a book published, because writing can seem like I guess in some ways, when you're actually writing, it can seem like quite a lonely process because you're just there in front of a laptop. However, once a book is published, you just think of all the people involved in that. You've got to go down and meet your agents. They're going to ask you, what other books have you got in the pipeline? Can we turn this into a 3-book series? We're going to need a PR agent. We're going to need a photographer to take a picture of you for the flyleaf of the book. There's so many other people involved in these processes. And I say that to try and encourage people who maybe listen to the podcast, say, well, I've got nothing to offer. Actually, you really have. And without you, we're lost.
And all those people are created in their own right as well.
And it's interesting in the Bible, isn't it, that when you think of the list of people who were involved in, for example, the building of the temple and the various skills that were required, and then the complex instructions of the beautiful things that were put in the temple. It's extraordinary. I always remember going to see years ago, I think it was at a conference somewhere, I think it was Brighton, and heard a guy, I don't know if you've heard of him, called David Roos, who's
No.
a Canadian musician, worship leader. And he did a seminar on, I think it was to do something to do with creativity and music, whatever. But he talked about how in Revelation, that description of the throne room with light going from every direction and a crystal sea in front, isn't it? And then he said it's like thunder and lightning. And he said, it was better than a Genesis light show. And I just thought, well, actually, that just shows the creativity of God, doesn't it? In an extraordinary way. I mean, I would like to go and see that. I don't know about the rest of you. I'm not ready to go yet, but I would love to go and see that. I think that's going to be extraordinary.
But just taking that back to creation, we talk about God the creator, but just looking at a beautiful scene and a sunset, and every scene that you would see is a function of light and wind and color and natural vegetation and all that. And and all you're doing is observing it. You're seeing the effects of it, and that's all. People who are more naturalistic in their view, would say, "Oh, it's all just an accident of whatever." But I do believe that God provides beauty for us to behold, and to make us uplifted in our spirit, particularly if we're feeling low. And that's an expression of His creativity. Anything we can do is pale in comparison to that, because that's the ultimate expression of creativity. And I'm not an observant person normally. That's Monica. Like, I couldn't even describe the outside of our house. I mean, I couldn't even describe what there's behind me. And yet sometimes God will hit you with something, and I'm sure David Jones has been experiencing that.
That's a roof tile falling off the roof, Steve.
Because I can see what's behind me now because I can actually see it, but I can never. It's a case of being very mindful of the world around you. But sometimes God actually hits you with it. And I was going to say, David is now. Are you actually you're in the Lake District now? Then.
Yes, I am. So
Yeah.
we've had, apart from Tuesday afternoon when we had a load of rain after a fabulous morning where basically a huge blanket of snow fell on us. The weather has been absolutely glorious. So I was out last night about 8:30. We're miles away from any kind of light pollution whatsoever.
Oh, wow.
And so, we had the backbone of space, the Milky Way, clearly in view.
You see the Milky Way? Wow.
Yeah, it was just incredible. So that inspires me. But again, as you said, Steve, in Genesis we see. I think that the phrase, I might be wrong about this, but I'm sure the phrase is, I don't know the Latin or the Greek off the top of my head, but it means to create something out of nothing.
Yeah.
And that can seem, I guess, quite daunting for ordinary mortals like ourselves. But I don't know about you, David, and you, Steve, but when I sit down at a laptop, so sometimes it can feel like work, although enjoyable work. But other times, the more you practice, I may have said this to you before, Steve, the more I practice with the writing, the more I find every now and again the muse arrives and sprinkles some sort of magic fairy dust over the keyboard. And suddenly you feel like you can write for hours. I was writing some dialogue on Tuesday night on my bed, and it just flowed. I mean, I must have written about 3 pages of dialogue in the space of 20 minutes because it was just there, and I couldn't get the words out quickly enough. So now and again that happens, and other times it feels like I'm having to plod my way through this and work hard at it. But that's what happens. So, and again, I would implore everybody else listening to work at these things, find that thing. We've already mentioned about end credits on movies and TV shows, but what about choreographers? What about people who do synchronized swimming? I was watching something earlier with the actor Chris Hemsworth, where he goes to try and exercise some muscles in his upper arms because he's about to do some kind of rope climb. And even though this guy is the actor who plays Thor, he's very weak in that area. To try and climb up a rope for him is very, very difficult. So they suggest trying rowing with a partner. And you see this New Zealand lady who got the bronze medal at one of the Olympics a few years ago. And you see her out on the water and it looks graceful. It looks effortless. And these two blokes get into the same rowing boat and they nearly actually sink the boat when they get in. They can't even stand on it properly or sit down on it properly. So these things require work, but with effort and with exercising those creative juices, those creative muscles, you can get better at all kinds of things.
So you can develop a skill in creative-ish things. But Steve, you're one of these people who, when you sit down and you start writing and you've got a subject, you can just flow very easily, can't you?
I never, ever have had writer's block. It's just not in my vocabulary. I'm not saying that to boast. It's just the way it is. I mean, the play that we've just recorded, which is set in Rhineland with Humpty Dumpty and David here. Okay, talk about creativity. He is an actor as well. So we have a character called Teddy Bear, like Teddy Bear, and he's a detective because a cute bunny is creating havoc in Rhineland, and the detective has to sort it out. So rather than just play it straight, young David here decided to put on an accent which is half Maigret, half Rene from Hello Hello. Not quite sure if that isn't creativity. But the thing is, when I wrote that while I was on holiday. I was bored. I was actually in the Lake District, believe it or not. And I used to get up early and sit on my laptop and just write those dialogues. And I finished the complete screenplay in the holiday. And when I look at it now, I thought, how on earth should I come up with some of those dialogues? Because I have to say, when you hear them actually spoken, it's some really good interactions there. And that's another thing that, so we created this little drama group, and there's at least half the people there that have never done it before in their lives. I mean, there were people like David here and Nigel who perhaps done a bit of acting before, but a lot of people there have never done it, and they've been brilliant. And if that's not creativity, they would never have called themselves voice actors or anything creative before. But the thing is, you just do it. You've got to get out of your comfort zone. And I think that's the problem with a lot of people, is being scared of actually doing it. Just don't worry if you sound silly. Don't worry if you think people are going to laugh at you. Have a go. And more often than not, it will work out for you, and it will give you great satisfaction. Because we recorded these things, and they'll be there forever for these people to say, I'm not a creative person, but this is something I did in 2023.
Well, I think it's a good point, Steve, because this is something that none of us have done before in terms of doing a podcast.
Yeah. Oh, this too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we did have something years ago, and I think David Jones did come with his delightful wife, talking about 12 years ago, but we did it in real time around the table, like real human beings together.
Yeah.
And we called it Saffron Planet. That was the first time around. But this is different, and the fact that it's using Zoom, it brings its own challenges, I think. But I think we've all got used to that. And podcasts, I mean, goodness, I just opened the Evening Standard, and every newspaper now, they've all moved into podcasts, and they've all got a whole selection of them. It is the growing thing. So I suppose we're trying the same thing. I don't know whether what we're doing now would be something that would be generally interesting for people, or just for those that go to our website. But who knows? If you do like what you're listening to, do.
Well, I think I think for people who are listening to this, the question would be, I'm listening to these guys, and there's a couple of tremendously creative people, and one who thinks he might be, but he's also thinks he might not be. What if I wanted to be more creative? How would I go about it? And one of the things that struck me that you said, Steve, was in a sense that the road to success is paved with failure, that you have to try it. And very often you're going to fail when you first start. And again, along the lines of what you were saying, David, about you learn to do certain things as you develop the skill and you're persistent with it. And something when I did training, business training for 15, 20 years. I always forget exactly how long it was. And when I first started, I felt very nervous about it. But by the time I finished, there were like 20 subjects I could cover. And I could cover the training, sort of usually it was between 9 o'clock and 4 o'clock, without any notes on any of those subjects. And very often I would find creative ways to communicate. Actually, whilst I was doing it, I'd had no idea what I was going to say until I opened my mouth and I had a felt tip pen and I did something on a board or whatever, or got people engaged in an activity that would enable them to learn. And one of the things, I was sort of rambling a little bit here, but there was something which I came across, which was like 4 stages of learning. And the first stage is where you are unconsciously incompetent. In other words, you don't know what you don't know. And it's then when you start doing a skill. For example, if I was to start doing art, and this is where I'd like to ask Rosie about it, because my view is I am no good at art. And I think as soon as I start doing it, I become consciously incompetent.
Mm.
And I think that is very often the point at which people give up, because they go, do you know what? I can't do this.
Mm.
I've realized that the standard and what I'm trying to achieve is far above my ability, and that I'm never going to get there. And then actually, if you persist with it and you keep on practicing, you reach a point where you are consciously competent. In other words, you have to think about what you're doing, and it still takes an effort for you to do it. But the more you do it, you then get to the point where you are unconsciously competent. You do it without thinking. And it's a bit like driving, isn't it? You get to the point. I mean, I don't know now, but sometimes, if you're like me, I can drive 10 miles and then think, I'm not sure how I got here, because I can't remember actually driving it. I've done it automatically because that unconscious competence has kicked in. And I think that's going to be what happens when you get the muse, David and Steve, when you're writing as well.
Mm.
I think definitely, if I can be permitted to just tell a very quick true story. For many, many years, I was having a recurring nightmare in which I was being pursued by a lion, a man-eating lion, who obviously wanted a manwich for his lunch. Every time I had the nightmare, I would somehow manage to escape the clutches or the claws of this fierce manhunter. I would scramble up into a tree, and I know lions can climb trees, but this one couldn't, or onto a ledge or onto a building. And this went on for maybe 20, 25 years.
Oh.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is completely true. So this may really encourage people. I hope it does. Those of you who've not heard the story.
I've heard the story now. You've brought it back to me. Yeah, carry on.
There you go. And I went to visit her brother and her sister-in-law, David and Ginny, who live in Atlanta. And on the Sunday morning, we decided to go to this church because we knew there was a worship leader there called Laura Story, who we both liked. This huge church called the Perimeter Church in Atlanta. So we went along, met Laura, had a conversation with her afterwards, which was lovely. And this church was so big that it had its own bookshop. So we went into the bookshop. I was looking around, couldn't really see anything. And then Jo came over to me and she presented me with this book that she'd just discovered, which was called In a Pit with a Lion on a Snowy Day. So she said, I think you should read this book. So while we were still in the States, I started to read it. And about 2/3 of the way through, one of the guys in the book that was mentioned was having the same nightmare that I was having. It's like, whoa, this is just bizarre. So a friend of his suggests, why don't you go and see your local minister and see whether he can help you? So he goes to see his minister, and to cut a long story short, his minister turns around to him and says, well, look, next time you have the nightmare, why don't you try and ask subconsciously the following question, why are you chasing me? So the guy has the nightmare again. Somehow, miraculously, he manages to ask the line that question, why are you chasing me? And then the line comes back with the question, with the answer, I am your courage. Stop running away from me.
Ah,
And that story was the catalyst for me in 2009, to give up my full-time teaching career and pursue my other love, which was acting. And I say this to encourage anybody who's listening. 2 years later, on a very snowy day, I was driving over the M62 motorway on my way to ITV Studios, where remarkably, with no training whatsoever, no drama training, way outside my comfort zone, I was one of about 6 people who got an audition for Emmerdale. Now, unfortunately, I didn't get the role, but just the mere fact that I'd gotten people and who treated me brilliantly, I can't praise them enough. They were wonderful people at the Emmerdale Studios in Yorkshire. And so that's what can happen when you step outside that comfort zone.
mm,
When you let go of your fear and you decide, no, I'm going to pursue this. And one of the things I'm now going to do, because obviously now I've had to take early retirement due to ill health, I can't actually work. I'm not allowed to get any paid employment because of the agreement that I've got with my college until July 12th. But I'm going to use that time, obviously, to write. But I'm also going to use that time to look again at the acting once July 12th arrives.
Good. Well, we're giving you plenty of practice on the audio side, so
it's a great,
So,
it's a
has
great,
the line-
great story, though, isn't it?
yeah. I was going to say, has the line come back? Has it gone?
Steve, and I'd say this with absolute integrity, from the moment I finished that book until today, which is now 15 years or so, 14, 15 years, I've never had that nightmare since.
Wow. Amazing.
I think there's something happens with creativity and the arts in particular, and all those people that you talked about, David, who come together to make things happen. And it reminded me actually that at the end of the Lord of the Rings, the credits go on for longer than the film.
That's what I was thinking. And it's a long film.
But there's something about, particularly I think when Christians are involved with stuff, that you can bypass the intellect and it can speak directly into people's spirit in a way that is quite remarkable. I remember hearing the story, and to be honest, I'm not sure who told me. It told me this, but it might have been David Roos at that same conference, where they were talking about the animated film by Disney of Beauty and the Beast. And I think there's a bit in it, I can't even remember it because it's some time ago since I saw it, where the beast transforms into a handsome prince. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the inspiration for that whole scene was actually the resurrection of Christ.
Wow.
And the guys who were involved with it and drew it and animated it were Christians, and that in the back of their mind, that was what they were trying to demonstrate. And it was a very powerful part of the film, I think.
But there's the obvious Narnia connection from that, isn't there?
Yeah.
You know, with
Yeah.
Aslan. I just wondered whether it was Aslan that was appearing in your dreams, David. But Aslan was a good lion.
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah.
But there again,
Yeah.
you've got C.S. Lewis, who ostensibly was an old English scholar, produces these books which have had such an incredible impact on kids over the years
Me
and
too.
adults.
Yeah, I regularly read Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe and The Magician's Nephew. Those two in particular. I regularly read them every few years.
Yeah.
And they're fresh every time.
Sorry, Steve, what's the extraordinary line in it? Does the line Line, where somebody asked the question, is he good? is Aslan good? And he says, he's not good, he's safe. Or is it the other way around? I can't remember now.
Yeah, I know what you
Not
mean.
safe, but he is good. I can't remember.
He's not safe. Yeah, yeah. I know
Yeah.
what you mean, because I've actually quoted from that in the book, and I've forgotten it because I've got a terrible memory. But yes, he's not safe. But it's such a positive figure, and to think that this ostensibly dry Irish academic could have the imagination and the creativity to be able to convert these very strong symbols of Christianity into something that kids and adults can immediately get. When I read it, I didn't. When I was a kid and reading it, I thought, "Oh, that's about Jesus. That is." You have to be told that, and afterwards you say, "Oh yes." But I think it could, in a sense, open you up to the possibility of the idea of resurrection by what happened to a lion that was the representative of something that was just so good and holy and separate, and to be killed and then come back. Just the motives behind that, I think would actually enter your psyche as a young kid, and to be used by God to open you up to something, to make a decision later on. So that is creativity at its best, to be able to create works of that quality. I did try to write one when 10 years ago. This thing about persisting, I wrote a whole novel for kids from start to finish and sent it to one agent. They showed no interest, so I just shelved it. And for me, it was just the joy of writing it.
Yes.
I haven't shown it to anyone since, and it's the whole story of creation, right up to from creation up to Moses, but done in allegory with fantasy figures. And I had so much joy writing it that I didn't actually need anyone to read it or to get it published. It wasn't important for me. So for me, going back to creativity, the core subject is the act of creating. For me, is so satisfying for me personally that even if no one ultimately takes any notice, it wouldn't be as disastrous as it may be for other people who maybe just get one idea in their lives. Because I get more ideas in one day than some people probably get in their lifetime, and that's not a boast. Because you've got to be in the inside of my head to know what I'm talking about, and thankfully you're not.
Yes, thankfully we're not. But it's remarkable what comes out from people who do have minds like that. And, going back to C.S. Lewis, I love The Magician's Nephew. I would love to see that
I
as
love
a
that.
film.
Me too. Yeah.
I think, to see the kind of the creation taking place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Would be
Yeah.
extraordinary. But the one that really got me by C.S. Lewis was The Last Battle, which has a strange kind of beginning, but then there's this point when effectively everybody, all the characters from the various stories, end up in what is essentially heaven. And there's a description of the saying, they're looking at people and they say they were neither young nor old, they were just who they were. And I thought that was gorgeous description, because I thought, well, what are you going to be like when you get to heaven? Are you going, you're going to be all grey haired with a Zimmer frame, or are you going to be the young person who was, running in the Olympics? And neither old or young, but just who they were. It was them. And then there's this description, wasn't it, of that being onwards and upwards and going deeper and deeper into I don't know what did they call it in the book? Didn't call it heaven.
Don't remember. But I do. I've just Googled this. Aslan. Of course, he isn't safe, but he is good. He is not a tame lion.
That's it. He's not a tame lion. Yeah. Brilliant. Well, look, I think we're going to draw to a close there, because we've tackled a few issues about creativity, but I think this is going to be the first part of a two-part series. And in the second part, we're hoping that Rosie Smith, one of our very good friends, is going to join us, who's a tremendously creative person involved in all sorts of arts, including dance. And I think we should be able to pick her brains about how she encourages people to be more creative. But for now, I think let's call it a day. So it's goodbye from me, David Shepherd, and from
Bye
Steve,
from me.
and
And
from
it's
David.
goodbye for me.
And we'll catch up with you next time. Bye for now.
Bye.